I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, as the Syrian Arab Republic was recovering from the aftermath of the earthquake, burying its martyrs, and racing against time to deal with the catastrophic consequences of the devastating earthquake, terrorist and Israeli occupation forces were lurking to target Syria and its people. Terrorist ISIS carried out a brutal attack, killing 53 people and injuring others while they were hunting truffles in the city of Al-Sukhna in eastern Homs. Simultaneously with this terrorist attack, Israel launched an airstrike on Sunday, February 19th from the occupied Golan, using missiles on residential neighborhoods full of civilians in Damascus. According to initial numbers, this claimed the lives of 5 martyrs and seriously injured 15 civilians. It destroyed a number of civilian homes and caused material damage to a number of educational centers and historical sites. This Israeli terrorist attack is premeditated and is part of Israel's systematic targeting of Syrian civilians and civilian objects, including homes, service centers, airports, and seaports. These are prescribed war crimes and a gross violation of international law and the principles and provisions of the UN Charter. They are an explicit threat to peace and security in the Middle East. The Syrian Arab Republic called upon the Security Council to assume its primary responsibility and condemn these Israeli attacks, to take the necessary measures to deter them, to hold accountable and punish perpetrators, and ensure they are not repeated. Once again, Syria calls upon countries supporting Israel in this council, especially the United States of America, to stop obstructing the Security Council's fulfillment of its mandate to stop the crimes of the Israeli occupation and terrorist groups and hold them accountable. Madam President, more than 3 weeks have passed since the devastating earthquake struck Syria, leaving thousands of victims and injured and destroying hundreds of buildings, infrastructure, and service facilities. The Syrian government continues, within its limited capabilities, to make every possible effort to facilitate the emergency response to the earthquake in the 4 affected governorates. In this regard, the Syrian government provided the necessary facilities and exemptions for the arrival of humanitarian aid and relief workers through the 3 Syrian airports, the Latakia seaport, and the land border crossings with Lebanon and Jordan. It granted open approvals and facilities to the United Nations, international organizations operating in Syria, including by facilitating and accelerating customs procedures, granting visas, ensuring the entry of supplies, and emergency relief workers to support those affected. At the same time, the Syrian government stressed its commitment to deliver humanitarian assistance to all Syrians wherever they are in Syria, including in northwestern Syria. The Syrian government took a sovereign decision to approve the opening of 2 additional border crossings, namely Bab al-Salam and al-Ra'i, for a period of 3 months to deliver humanitarian assistance to our people in that region. This decision allowed the entry of hundreds of trucks carrying humanitarian aid, which reflects the importance of the agreement reached with the United Nations. The Syrian government also continued to grant necessary approvals and facilities to UN agencies to deliver humanitarian aid from within Syria. It approved the planning of cross-line humanitarian missions to northwestern Syria for a period of 6 months to provide humanitarian assistance and conduct humanitarian needs assessments in that area to respond to the repercussions of the earthquake and the aftershocks. In this regard, we reaffirm the importance of continuing to implement all these measures in good faith. We reject all attempts to politicize the humanitarian situation in Syria, whether by the terrorist al-Nusra Front, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, giving orders to prevent the cross-line entry of humanitarian assistance, or the skepticism and disruption by some Western states of the Syrian government's decision to allow the entry of humanitarian assistance through 2 new border crossings, as well as the allegations mentioned by these countries that assistance is being derailed. This was not confirmed by the United Nations. These are mere lies to disrupt the efforts by the Syrian government to ensure the delivery of humanitarian assistance to Syrians. Why have we not heard a condemnation by these countries of terrorist groups derailing the delivery of humanitarian assistance cross-line? Madam President, the Syrian Arab Republic once again expresses its thanks and appreciation to all countries that stood in solidarity with Syria and its people and promptly responded to the needs of Syrians facing such difficult circumstances. This brought important support to the national efforts to mitigate the impact of the earthquake and save the injured. We also express our appreciation to the UN Secretary-General for launching the flash appeal to respond to the catastrophic repercussions of the earthquake. International efforts should focus on rebuilding infrastructure and addressing the damage to the necessary service, health, and educational facilities. This is urgent for the return of the displaced affected by the earthquake to their regions and homes. In this regard, we express serious concern over the low funding of the humanitarian response plan for Syria. The 2022 plan has received less than 50% of funding. We therefore call upon donor countries to provide the necessary funding to the humanitarian response plan and to the humanitarian flash appeal to Syria to ensure the delivery of humanitarian assistance to all those in need across the country. Madam President, in his latest report on the humanitarian situation in Syria, the Secretary-General reaffirmed the importance of providing clear assurances that unilateral sanctions do not interfere with relief operations benefiting Syrian people. We are well aware that the United States of America and the European Union will not acknowledge the extent of the negative impacts of the unilateral sanctions they imposed on Syrians. For this reason, I will briefly present some aspects that prove that such unjust sanctions have a harmful effect on Syrians and that prove them wrong. They prove that these sanctions were originally designed for this purpose. 1. Sanctions and restrictions imposed on the Syrian air transport sector and civil aviation equipment affected the safety of civil passengers. They have caused many difficulties for international relief flights to Syrian airports before and after the disaster. Many international airlines were forced to use Beirut Airport for fear of these sanctions, causing additional costs and delaying the delivery of assistance to the victims of the earthquake. 2. Sanctions and restrictions imposed on public and private hospitals in Syria, including children's hospitals, and the prevention of international companies from selling medicines and necessary medical equipment to Syria exacerbated the vulnerability of the health sector in Syria, including during the pandemic and the earthquake. 3. Sanctions and restrictions imposed on importing oil and its derivatives to Syria have caused an acute shortage of fuel used for heating, transportation, and electricity generation. Moreover, the illegal seizure by the United States of oil and gas fields in Syria and oil smuggling operations have deprived the Syrian people of this important material and its billion-dollar revenues. 4. Sanctions and restrictions imposed on the import of power stations, power-related equipment, and spare parts have deprived Syrians of heating and electricity for more than 20 hours per day on average. 5. Sanctions and restrictions imposed on importing equipment and machinery necessary for supplying drinking water, irrigation, sterilizing and purifying water, repairing and improving the sewage system caused the spread of many diseases, especially cholera. 6. Sanctions and restrictions imposed on the import of heavy construction machinery and other construction equipment to Syria weakened its ability to deal with the repercussions of the earthquake and demonstrated the urgent need for such equipment to save tens of thousands of people from under the rubble and debris and to build housing units for hundreds of thousands of earthquake victims. 7. Sanctions and restrictions imposed on the import of fertilizers needed for agricultural food production or requirements for their local production have caused irreparable damage to Syria's agricultural production capacity and contributed to a sharp rise in the cost of locally produced food. They undermined food security for Syrians and caused acute malnutrition. 8. And finally, sanctions and restrictions imposed on Syrian banks, including the central bank, have led to the freezing or severing of financial relations with foreign banks and prevented them from carrying out the necessary financial transactions for all the aforementioned vital sectors. Ladies and gentlemen, the list goes on. These are just samples and examples of the negative repercussions of these American and European sanctions. Madam President, in conclusion, I would like to note that the efforts to fight the destructive repercussions of the earthquake are ongoing and require great international support and enormous capabilities. This will not be possible when this will only be possible when humanitarian considerations are prioritized over political considerations, when sincere and genuine support is provided for Syria and its people, when donors fulfill their commitments, and when a safe and stable environment is provided for Syrians. This requires providing support to counterterrorism efforts, stopping the repeated and systematic Israeli attacks, ending the illegal foreign presence on Syrian territories, and the immediate, complete, and unconditional lifting of the unilateral coercive sanctions imposed on the Syrian people. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.